Heathrow Airport, London. October 15th, 1978. A British Airways Boeing 707 sits on a remote stand with 112 people trapped inside. Police snipers cannot see the cockpit. Negotiators cannot move the needle. The hijackers swear they have wired the cabin to blow. But 18 hours in, a maintenance van rolls up like it belongs there. 6 men in coveralls climb out carrying toolboxes and a clipboard marked ECS Pressurization Fault. The tower radios that the plane is unsafe unless inspected right now. If the hijackers buy it, everyone lives. If they don't, the next sound is an explosion. This is Operation Wrench. The man who walked into that trap does not exist in public records. His service file contains a photograph, a redacted name, and a call sign we will render as Wrench Lead. He came up through a selection process that valued one trait above marksmanship or physical endurance: the capacity to project authority in environments designed to strip it away. His instructors were not soldiers. They were behavioral psychologists and former hostage negotiators who understood that enclosed spaces amplify every micro-expression, every hesitation, every tell. His formative experience occurred in a training facility outside Hereford during the spring of 1976. The scenario involved a mock aircraft cabin populated with role players instructed to escalate toward violence. Wrench Lead's task was not to storm the cabin. It was to enter as a flight attendant and convince armed actors that their best strategic option was to accept tea service. He succeeded by doing something instructors had not anticipated. He brought real tea. He heated it properly. He moved through the cabin with the practiced tedium of someone who had performed the routine thousands of times. The armed role players accepted cups. The scenario ended without shots fired. The debrief note read, "Operative understands that authenticity is not performance. It is system-level coherence." By 1978, Wrench Lead had been deployed on 4 operations where the entry vector was deception rather than force. 2 involved false flag recruitment approaches. 1 involved a vehicle breakdown staged outside a target's residence. The 4th remains classified, but involved convincing a foreign intelligence officer that a safe house fire was accidental rather than operational cover for document photography. His skill was not lying. It was constructing scenarios where the truth and the lie used the same evidence. This background made him the inevitable choice when Flight 291 became a geometry problem that negotiation could not solve. The hijacking began at 0840 hours when 4 men boarded the flight during a refueling stop in Istanbul. They carried weapons assembled from components smuggled through security across multiple checkpoints. Their stated objective was the release of prisoners held by British authorities and safe passage to an unspecified Middle Eastern nation. Their tactical advantage was total. They controlled a sealed environment with no clear assault path and had demonstrated willingness to harm hostages by injuring a flight attendant during the initial takeover. British authorities faced constraints that turned standard hostage doctrine into a logic trap. The aircraft sat on a remote hardstand at Heathrow, positioned to prevent spillover into terminal operations, but also positioned beyond optimal sniper coverage. The Boeing 707's fuselage created blind spots that rendered external observation incomplete. Thermal imaging suggested the hijackers had taken positions that maximized their coverage of cabin doors and emergency exits. Any forced entry would be detected in time for them to execute their threat. And intelligence analysis confirmed they possessed the technical knowledge to construct viable, explosive devices. The doctrine governing British counter-terror response in 1978 prioritized containment and negotiation. The framework assumed that time-degraded hijacker resolve while building tactical options. But 18 hours into the standoff, negotiators reported that the hijackers were not fatiguing. They were rotating watch schedules. They were maintaining discipline, and they had begun discussing deadlines with the specificity of people who had planned for extended operations. The strategic assessment reached the desk of the Home Secretary at 2000 hours on October 15th. The conclusion was unambiguous. Negotiation had reached its ceiling. Force was necessary. But conventional assault methodologies carried an unacceptable probability of mass casualty. The operation required a method that did not yet exist in British doctrine. It required creating permission where none existed. The concept emerged from a conversation between Wrench Lead and a senior planner from the Special Air Service. The planner posed a question that reframed the problem. If hijackers controlled entry by force, could entry be achieved by invitation? If the aircraft was a fortress, could it be treated as a machine requiring maintenance? The question sounded absurd until Wrench Lead asked a follow-up. What would make hijackers believe that refusing maintenance was more dangerous than allowing it? The answer was environmental control systems. The Boeing 707's ECS regulated cabin pressure and temperature. A malfunction was not theoretical. It was a documented failure mode that had grounded aircraft and triggered emergency protocols. More critically, ECS faults presented visible symptoms: temperature fluctuations, pressure changes, unusual sounds from the air conditioning packs. Symptoms that could be described over radio. Symptoms that could be fabricated by the control tower. Symptoms that would force hijackers to choose between accepting inspectors or risking a catastrophic system failure that would kill hostages and hijackers alike. The plan required 3 elements. First, a cover story so technically detailed that it could withstand hijacker scrutiny. Second, a team capable of projecting absolute credibility as maintenance workers while carrying concealed weapons. Third, a tower script that sold the urgency without revealing the deception. Each element had to function as part of an integrated system because hijackers would test the story at every interface. A single inconsistency would collapse the operation and likely trigger executions. Wrench Lead understood the core challenge. The operation's success depended on psychological misdirection at the moment of maximum vulnerability. The team would be standing inside the cabin, surrounded by armed men, with no backup and no cover. If the hijackers detected weapons before the assault initiated, the operators would die. If the assault began before operators controlled the explosive device, hostages would die. The margin was not measured in minutes. It was measured in the time required for a hijacker to process suspicion and translate it into action. During the planning session, Wrench Lead described what he called the authenticity gradient. He explained that deception failed most often at transition points where one system interfaced with another. A fake maintenance crew could be convincing in appearance, but when they interacted with tower communications, with aircraft systems, with the physical environment of the cabin, every interface point created an opportunity for the story to fracture. The solution was not better acting. It was better systems integration. The cover story had to be supported by real maintenance protocols, real radio procedures, real documentation. The lie had to be surrounded by so much truth that detecting it required expertise the hijackers did not possess. The human cost of this approach was not discussed in the planning documents, but it was present in the room. One of the psychologists attached to the operation asked Wrench Lead how he would manage the cognitive load of maintaining a false identity while preparing to execute lethal force. Wrench Lead responded that he would not manage it. He would inhabit it. He described his method as total commitment to the immediate role, which meant suppressing awareness of the violence to come until the moment it became operationally necessary. The psychologist noted this approach carried long-term risks. Wrench lead acknowledged the risks and stated they were acceptable relative to the alternative. By 0200 hours on October 16th, authorization came through from the highest levels of government. The operation was approved with one condition. If the hijackers rejected the maintenance story, the team was to withdraw and the siege would continue. No forced assault. The condition existed because political leadership understood that a failed deception would be worse than no attempt at all. It would confirm to the hijackers that the British government was willing to sacrifice the appearance of good faith negotiation, which would eliminate future leverage. The clock was now visible. The hijackers had set a deadline of 1800 hours on October 16th for their demands to be met. If not, they would begin executing hostages at 30-minute intervals. The maintenance operation had to be staged, approved by the hijackers, and executed before that deadline. The window was 14 hours. The cover infrastructure was not assembled. It was borrowed. Heathrow maintenance operations ran continuously across multiple shifts, with dozens of active work orders at any given time. The deception team did not create a parallel system. They inserted themselves into the existing one using access credentials and radio protocols that were functionally identical to legitimate operations. The primary fabrication was a single work order logged into the system at 0330 hours on October 16th. Referencing ECS pack anomalies detected during routine monitoring of aircraft on the hardstand. The work order number was Alpha Echo 772/16. It cited British Airways Maintenance Directive M-341, governing environmental control troubleshooting procedures. The directive was real. The anomaly was not. But the documentation trail was designed to withstand casual verification because hijackers could potentially demand that tower controllers read back maintenance logs or confirm work order validity. The team consisted of 6 Special Air Service operators with specific selection criteria. 2 had prior experience as aircraft mechanics before military service. The remaining 4 had completed a compressed 48-hour training cycle on Boeing 707 systems, focused entirely on ECS components and the physical layout of access panels. They were not taught to repair the system. They were taught to sound competent when discussing it and to move through the cabin as if they had done so hundreds of times before. The equipment list was sparse by design. 2 standard British Airways toolboxes containing actual maintenance implements. Multimeters, pressure gauges, duct inspection mirrors, wire strippers, technical manuals. Hidden within the tool trays were weapons broken into components that resembled mechanical parts. Pistol frames were shaped like gauge housings. Magazines resembled battery packs. The assembly process required fewer than 12 seconds per weapon. The design was not elegant. It was functional. Communication protocols relied on existing tower frequencies with one modification. A dedicated line connected the tower supervisor to the operation commander, who was positioned in a mobile command unit 200 meters from the aircraft. This allowed the tower to receive real-time guidance on how to respond to hijacker questions while maintaining the appearance of normal air traffic control operations. The tower supervisor, a veteran controller with 23 years of experience, had been briefed at 0200 hours and instructed to treat the maintenance scenario as if it were entirely legitimate, unless specifically directed otherwise. Wrench lead conducted a final briefing at 0400 hours in a hangar office that had been cleared of non-essential personnel. He did not discuss tactics. He discussed psychology. He explained that the hijackers would be testing the story at 2 levels. The surface level was technical. Did the mechanics know their aircraft systems? The deeper level was behavioral. Did the mechanics act like people annoyed by paperwork rather than people preparing for violence? He told the team that the second test was more important than the first. A mechanic who knew too much would be suspicious. A mechanic who seemed mildly inconvenienced by the interruption to his shift would be credible. One operator asked about the explosive device. Intelligence estimates suggested the hijackers had constructed a dead man switch mechanism, meaning that if the holder was killed or incapacitated, the circuit would close and detonate the device. Wrench lead confirmed this was the primary threat and stated that the assault plan prioritized immobilizing the device holder's hands before engaging other targets. The margin for error was the time required for muscles to contract involuntarily during incapacitation. That margin was measured in fractions of a second. At 0612 hours, the tower initiated the script. The controller radioed the hijackers using the emergency frequency they had been monitoring throughout the siege. The message was calibrated for technical credibility and manufactured urgency. The controller stated that ground monitoring equipment had detected fluctuating pressure readings from the aircraft's ECS pack number 2, consistent with a compressor seal failure. If the system remained powered without inspection, the failure could progress to complete loss of cabin pressure or thermal runaway in the pack assembly. The controller emphasized that this was not a negotiating tactic. It was a safety protocol mandated by aviation regulations. The controller offered to send maintenance personnel to inspect and, if necessary, temporarily bypass the affected pack to stabilize the system. The hijackers did not respond immediately. 11 minutes passed. During this interval, the operation team sat in the maintenance van with doors closed, wearing coveralls and high-visibility vests, listening to the silence on the radio. Wrench lead later described this interval as the most cognitively demanding phase of the operation, because the team had to remain in character, despite not knowing whether the cover story had succeeded or failed. At 0623 hours, the hijackers responded. They demanded that the tower provide technical details about the malfunction. The tower supervisor, reading from a script prepared by actuals British Airways engineers, explained that ECS pack number 2 was showing compressor discharge temperatures 12 degrees above normal parameters, and that acoustic sensors were detecting vibration consistent with bearing degradation. The explanation was sufficiently technical to sound authoritative and sufficiently mundane to sound truthful. The hijackers conferred off radio for 7 minutes. At 0630 hours, they stated they would permit one mechanic to approach the aircraft for visual inspection of the external pack housing. No tools, no entry to the cabin, just inspection. This was the first decision point. Allowing a single operator to approach without backup created a hostage scenario within a hostage scenario. But refusing would invalidate the entire cover story. Wrench lead volunteered immediately. He exited the van, carrying only a clipboard and a flashlight. He walked at the pace of someone accustomed to pre-dawn maintenance calls, not hurried, but not lingering. He approached the starboard side of the fuselage where the ECS pack was housed in the lower fairing. The hijackers watched him from cabin windows. Wrench lead performed a visual inspection that lasted approximately 4 minutes, during which he examined access panels, checked for obvious signs of damage, and made notes on the clipboard. The notes were real maintenance observations about minor wear that existed on the aircraft. He then returned to the van and reported to the tower over the radio that external inspection was inconclusive and that internal diagnostics were required to isolate the fault. The tower radioed this assessment to the hijackers and added a new detail. If the pack was not serviced within 2 hours, British Airways protocol required the aircraft to be shut down completely, which would eliminate cabin lighting, climate control, and lavatory systems. This detail was designed to create a cost for refusing service that affected the hijackers' own operational environment. At 0651 hours, The hijackers agreed to allow a two-person team to board for diagnostic work. They imposed conditions. One hijacker would escort the mechanics at all times. Tools would be inspected before entry, and any attempt to communicate with hostages would result in immediate execution of a passenger. The operation entered its highest risk phase. Wrench lead and one other operator, carrying a single toolbox between them, approached the aircraft stairs at 0700 hours. The pace remained deliberately casual. At the base of the stairs, a hijacker emerged and demanded to inspect the toolbox. The operator opened it fully and stepped back, allowing the hijacker to examine the contents. The hijacker removed several items: a multimeter, a pressure gauge, a coil of safety wire. He inspected each for approximately 10 seconds, then replaced them. He did not recognize the weapon components because they were designed to resemble the surrounding tools in shape, weight, and finish. The hijacker permitted them to board. Wrench lead entered first, moving up the stairs with the gait of someone who climbed aircraft stairs routinely. Inside the cabin, the lighting was dim. Passengers sat in seats, many with their heads down, exhibiting the physical markers of prolonged stress. Shallow breathing, minimal movement, averted gazes. The hijacker escort positioned himself behind the operators, holding a pistol at low ready. Wrench lead moved toward the ECS access panel located in the forward cabin ceiling. He opened the panel, retrieved a flashlight, and began an inspection routine that was both authentic and strategically positioned. The panel placement gave him a clear line of sight down the cabin length. He could observe the positions of the other three hijackers. One was seated in the forward galley area. One was mid-cabin, walking the aisle. The fourth was aft, near the rear galley, and appeared to be holding a device consistent with a detonator trigger. The second operator knelt at a floor-level equipment bay, ostensibly checking pressurization sensors. This position placed him adjacent to the closest hijacker. The geometry was being established not for inspection, but for assault. Wrench lead maintained a running technical commentary, speaking to his partner in maintenance jargon that was accurate enough to sound authoritative. He discussed pack discharge temperatures, bleed air pressure differentials, and valve cycling patterns. The hijacker escort listened but showed no comprehension. This was intentional. The verbal content was less important than the rhythm and tone, which signaled routine technical work rather than tactical preparation. At 0714 hours, Wrench lead radioed the tower to report that the fault appeared to be intermittent and that a full diagnostic required additional personnel to monitor multiple system points simultaneously. The tower confirmed and stated that 4 additional maintenance staff were en route. The hijacker escort relayed this to his colleagues. After brief discussion, they permitted the expanded team to board, provided all tools were inspected. The remaining 4 operators approached at 0723 hours. The same inspection protocol was applied, the same components were examined and cleared. By 0730 hours, all 6 operators were inside the cabin, positioned under the premise of simultaneous system checks. 1 operator was at the cockpit door interface, ostensibly checking pneumatic pressure lines. 2 were mid-cabin at overhead access panels. 2 were aft, 1 near the detonator holder, 1 at the rear pressure bulkhead access. Wrench lead remained forward. The positions were not random. Each operator had a primary target and a backup responsibility. The critical path was the detonator. The operator positioned aft near that hijacker had the most constrained mission: immobilize the hands before they could complete the trigger action. This required precision at a distance measured in inches. The assault signal was not a countdown or a verbal command. It was a phrase embedded in technical dialogue. Wrench lead radioed the tower at 0742 hours and stated, "Pack temp is stable. Recommend reset on the number 2 valve." The word reset was the execute command. What occurred next was not cinematic. It was synchronized immobilization. The aft operator moved first, closing the distance to the detonator holder in one step and driving both hands onto the hijacker's wrists, pinning them against the armrest. Simultaneously, the operator to his right engaged the mid-cabin hijacker with a weapon assembled during the preceding 60 seconds. The forward operators engaged their targets within 2 seconds of the initial action. The cockpit line operator blocked the door to prevent hijacker retreat into the flight deck. The physics of the engagement were straightforward. Weapons were discharged at distances between 1 and 3 meters. The hijackers were armed, but not positioned for immediate response, because they had been observing mechanics performing maintenance tasks. The cognitive transition from observing to responding required time they did not have. The forward hijacker attempted to raise his weapon and was incapacitated before the muzzle cleared his waistline. The mid-cabin hijacker turned toward the sound of the first shots and was engaged before completing the turn. The aft hijacker near the detonator attempted to activate the device, but his hands were immobilized. A secondary operator engaged him while the primary maintained wrist control. The total duration from execute command to cessation of hostile action was 16 seconds. During this interval, 3 passengers sustained minor injuries from being struck by falling debris or operators moving through the cabin. No explosive device detonated. No hostage was shot. The hijackers were incapacitated before they could execute their contingency. The cockpit crew, who had been briefed via covert communication during the preceding hour, secured the flight deck and unlocked the door for operator entry. The cabin was declared secure at 0743 hours. Passengers began screaming only after the shooting stopped, delayed psychological response overwhelming the initial freeze response. Emergency medical teams entered at 0746 hours. Passengers were evacuated through forward and aft doors in a controlled flow that took 23 minutes to complete. 3 passengers required treatment for panic-related hyperventilation. 1 elderly passenger experienced a cardiac event that was stabilized on site. The hostages were transported to a secure facility for medical evaluation and intelligence debriefing. The hijackers were secured and transported under armed escort. 1 was pronounced dead at the scene from wounds sustained during the engagement. The other 3 survived and were taken into custody. The explosive device was rendered safe by explosive ordnance disposal teams who confirmed it was viable and functional. Had it been triggered, casualty estimates suggested 70 to 90% fatalities within the cabin. By 0900 hours, the scene was controlled by multiple agencies operating under information quarantine protocols. Passengers were separated for individual debriefing to establish timeline accuracy and identify any potential intelligence gaps. The aircraft was preserved as an evidence site with restricted access pending forensic documentation. Media access was denied under national security provisions, and official statements were limited to confirmation that a hijacking incident had been resolved with minimal casualties. The hostages presented a complex psychological profile in the hours following rescue. Medical personnel noted that many exhibited dissociative symptoms, flat affect, difficulty processing questions, fragmented recall of the final minutes. This was consistent with acute stress response in prolonged captivity scenarios. Several passengers reported not understanding that the maintenance crew had been armed until after the shooting began. 2 passengers stated they believed the shooting was the hijackers executing people, and only realized otherwise when emergency personnel entered. This delayed comprehension was a documented feature of high-intensity rescues where hostages had become acclimated to a threat baseline and could not rapidly process the transition to resolution. 3 passengers required psychiatric support beyond initial crisis intervention. 1. A 34-year-old businesswoman developed acute insomnia and intrusive recall that persisted for months. Another, a retired military officer, reported feeling anger toward the rescue team for not acting sooner. A projection response that clinical staff identified as guilt reassignment for his own perceived helplessness during the siege. The psychological toll was not uniformly distributed. Some passengers described feeling profound relief. Others described feeling nothing. The variance reflected pre-existing psychological resilience and the specific experiences each hostage endured during the 18-hour ordeal. Officially, the British government issued a statement at 1200 hours on October 16th describing the incident as a security operation conducted to safeguard civilian lives. The statement confirmed that hijackers had been neutralized, that hostages had been rescued with minimal injury, and that investigations were ongoing. It did not describe the methodology. References to maintenance personnel appeared nowhere in the public record. The operational details were classified under provisions that prohibited disclosure for 50 years. Privately, the assessment was more specific. The deception-led entry had succeeded because it exploited a vulnerability inherent to hostage-taking. The hijackers needed the aircraft to remain functional, which created a permission structure for external intervention. The operation demonstrated that credible technical pretexts could bypass force-based entry obstacles. But it also demonstrated the fragility of the method. The success margin had been measured in seconds and in the hijackers' incomplete understanding of British maintenance protocols. A more sophisticated adversary might have demanded credentials verification, direct communication with British Airways engineering staff, or visual confirmation of the supposed ECS fault. Any of these would have collapsed the deception. Strategically, Operation Wrench bought the British government a deterrence dividend. The operation's existence became known within intelligence circles despite classification, which had a chilling effect on future hijacking attempts in British airspace. Between 1978 and 1985, no commercial aircraft hijacking successfully landed on British soil. But the dividend carried a cost. Militant organizations learned to distrust maintenance interventions. By the early 1980s, protocols appeared in recovered training documents instructing hijackers to refuse all external service requests and to treat technical failures as acceptable operational risks. The deception had been used once successfully, which meant it could likely never be used again. For the operators, the aftermath was procedurally straightforward and psychologically complex. They were debriefed individually over a 3-day period, during which operational psychologists assessed for indicators of post-traumatic stress and ethical injury. Wrench Lead's debrief included a detailed examination of what psychologists termed identity fracture. The cognitive dissonance created by inhabiting a false role while preparing for lethal action. He described experiencing a moment during the cabin inspection when he had to remind himself that he was not actually a mechanic, that the technical work he was performing was a pretext, and that in minutes he would be shooting people. The psychologist noted that this moment represented a boundary crossing where operational compartmentalization had begun to erode. Wrench Lead was cleared for future operations, but was flagged for enhanced monitoring during subsequent deployments. The technique itself became doctrine. By 1980, deception-led access was formalized in British counter-terror planning documents as a primary method for resolving barricade and hijacking scenarios where conventional assault vectors were denied. Training programs incorporated behavioral authenticity modules, teaching operators to inhabit false roles with system-level coherence. The lesson was clear. Authority could be projected through alignment with bureaucratic expectations, and adversaries could be manipulated into granting permission for their own defeat. The legacy extended beyond tactics. The operation validated a philosophical principle that would define Western counter-terror methodology for decades. That force was most effective when delivered through frameworks that appeared non-threatening. This principle would manifest in various forms, from undercover operations to signals intelligence to drone warfare, all predicated on the idea that violence was most efficient when the target did not recognize the threat until after the mechanism was irreversible. But the deeper question remained unresolved in the classified after-action assessments and in the private reflections of those who planned and executed the operation. The question was not whether the deception worked. It did. The question was what it cost to succeed. Was Operation Wrench an act of mercy that saved 112 lives through tactical brilliance and psychological sophistication? The affirmative case is straightforward. 18 hours of negotiation had failed. The hijackers had credible means and stated intent to kill hostages, and conventional assault methods carried unacceptable casualty projections. The deception created a non-violent entry path that resolved the crisis with 0 hostage deaths and minimal injuries. The operators took enormous personal risk, walking into a confined space with armed adversaries at point-blank range. The success demonstrated restraint and precision. The alternative was a prolonged siege with probable executions, or a forced assault with mass casualties. Or was it an escalation that weaponized the civilian safety apparatus and established a precedent that made future crises more deadly? The critical case argues that transforming maintenance protocols into combat tactics corrupted the trust infrastructure that makes civilian aviation function. Every subsequent hijacker would now have to assume that mechanics, catering staff, fuel trucks, and medical personnel could be concealed assault teams. This assumption forces hijackers toward more extreme violence earlier in the crisis timeline, because the negotiation process itself becomes suspect. The operation succeeded tactically, but failed strategically by eliminating a future option. The next hijackers would not open the door. The answer is not located in doctrine or tactics. It is located in worldview. If you believe that state authority derives legitimacy from its capacity to protect citizens by any effective means, then deception is a tool like any other, justified by outcome. If you believe that legitimacy requires adherence to transparent rules even when those rules impose costs, then deception undermines the framework it claims to defend. What is your assessment? Was the transformation of mechanics into an assault vector a necessary innovation that saved lives, or a dangerous precedent that made the next crisis more violent? The question is not hypothetical. Variations of this methodology have been deployed dozens of times since 1978, in contexts ranging from hostage rescue to targeted killing operations. Each iteration raises the same question. When deception becomes indistinguishable from routine operations, who decides when the routine stops being real?